picture, a patch of grass on the Kansas plains, bent flat by wind, with nothing standing on it but a fence post gone grey with age. No wall, no chimney, no street, just grass, and under that grass, if you looked close enough, a few dark stains in the soil that don't belong to any plant that ever grew there, somewhere near that fence post. In the years just after the Civil War, 10,000 people once lived and worked and slept. They came for buffalo hides. They built a town so busy it had a newspaper, a hotel, and a bank that some folks say held more gold than any bank in Denver. Then, in the space of 2 winters, that town disappeared. Not slowly, not the way towns usually fade, with a few families leaving each year until the last store closes. This one emptied out almost all at once, like water going down a drain, and it never came back. We are going to spend the next few hours walking through what happened to towns like this. One, all across the Great Plains. Real places, real people, a mystery that has never been fully solved, no matter how many historians have tried. The story starts with grass, not the grass under that fence post today, but the grass that used to cover this whole country, ocean to ocean almost, thick and rich and full of protein. That grass fed the buffalo, and the buffalo, for a few strange and golden years, became the most valuable animal in America. Their hides tanned into leather for machine belts up north, their bones ground into fertilizer for eastern farms. Aye, a man with a good rifle and a steady hand could kill 50 animals in a morning and sell every hide for cash before the sun went down. A quick word before we go deeper. These stories don't end. There's a new unsolved one waiting here every night. If that's the kind of thing you'd leave on in the dark, subscribe and I'll keep them coming. Where there is money, people follow. And they followed fast. Hunters, skinners, traders, bankers who smelled profit on the wind. Within a season or two, a stretch of open prairie with no name at all would have a main street, a row of tents turned into buildings, and a population bigger than most county seats back east. These places grew the way a fire grows in dry timber, fast, bright, and hungry for more fuel than the land could give. You would have felt it if you had stood there. The ground under your boots would have hummed with wagon wheels from dawn until dark. The air would have carried the sharp, heavy smell of raw hides, stacked 20 feet high, waiting on rail cars that could not come fast enough. Wood smoke, gun oil, the metal tang of blood that never quite washed out of the dirt behind the skinning sheds. You would have heard hammers all day, building something that felt permanent, that felt like it was going to last 100 years. It didn't. Some of these towns vanished so completely that later surveyors could not agree on where they had even stood. Maps from the 1870s show a settlement with a name and a population count. Maps from the 1880s show empty grassland at the same coordinates, like an eraser passed over that one spot on the page. No burned buildings, no mass graves, no written account of a single dramatic night when everyone decided to leave. Just absence, spreading out across the plains like a stain in reverse. Historians have chased this question for over a century now. Some say it was simple economics, the herds vanishing and the money vanishing with them, plain and fast as a candle going out in the wind. Others aren't so sure that explains everything. Why would a town with a bank, a newspaper, a school just walk away and leave no trace at all? Why do some sites have almost nothing in the ground? No nails, no glass, no foundation stone, when a town that size should have left mountains of debris behind? That question sits at the center of everything we are about to explore tonight. It is the kind of question that pulls at old maps and older bones, at trading records and oral stories passed down through families who were here long before any hunter arrived with a rifle. It touches the buffalo herds themselves and how fast they could move, and how completely a place built on their backs could collapse when they didn't come back one spring. If you drove out to that patch of grass in Kansas today, you could park your truck on the shoulder of a gravel road and walk 50 feet into silence so complete you would hear your own heartbeat. Picture the plains in the early 1870s. Not the plains you know from photographs, brown and quiet and split by fences. Picture them alive. Grass rolls to every horizon, green in spring, gold by August, moving in waves when the wind pushes through it, like a hand dragged through water. And on that grass, in numbers that no one who saw them ever fully believed afterward, the buffalo move. You stand at the edge of one of these herds, and the ground hums under your boots. That is not a figure of speech. Millions of hooves striking dirt at once will do that to solid earth. The dust they raise climbs into the sky, like smoke from a fire that never burns out. And men who rode along the edges of these herds for days said the animals never seemed to end, that you could ride from sunup to sundown and still see brown backs rolling to the edge of the world. This is the resource. This is the fortune everyone is chasing. Not gold, not silver. Hide, tallow and bone. The trading posts spring up where the herds pass close to water. They are not much to look at, not at first. A sod hut. A tent with a stovepipe poking through the canvas. A corral made of green cottonwood posts, still leaking sap. But within a season, some of these places grow teeth. Board buildings replace the sod. A general store opens, its shelves stocked with tinned peaches and bolts of calico shipped in on freight wagons that groan under the weight of hide bales going the other direction. You can smell the place before you see it. That is what the old accounts say. The wind carries the smell of rawhide and rendered fat for miles before the rooftops ever break the horizon. A smell some men called sweet and others called sick, and nobody who smelled it forgot it. Add to that the wood smoke from a dozen stovepipes, the tang of gun oil, the animal reek of horses packed too close in a corral built for half their number. This is not a clean smell. This is the smell of money being made in real time. Walk the main street of one of these places at its peak, and you would see a world stitched together overnight. Hunters in canvas coats stiff with dried blood haggle with buyers over the price per hide. Freight men in wide hats check their wagon wheels before the long haul east. A blacksmith's hammer rings against iron somewhere close, steady as a heartbeat. Lanterns hang from porch posts, oil-fed, throwing orange light across boardwalks built from green lumber that still smells like the tree it came from at night. That light is the only light for 100 miles in any direction, a small gold smear against a dark so complete you could lose your own hand in front of your face. And here is the part that mattered more than anyone understood at the time. None of it was planned, the way a city is planned. No survey crew walked this ground first. No government office drew these streets on a map before the first board went up. These places grew the way a fire grows, following fuel, following opportunity, and nobody stopped to ask what would happen when the fuel ran out. The buffalo were the fuel. Everything else, the stores, the saloons, the little chapel someone nailed together from packing crates, all of it existed because the herds passed close enough to make the killing worth the wagon ride. If you had walked into one of these posts in its best season, You would have believed it was permanent. You would have seen men building second stories onto their stores. You would have seen a preacher lining up lumber for a real church, not a tent. You would have felt the confidence in the air, thick as the smoke over the tallow vats, the sense that this place had arrived and meant to stay. Nobody selling hides in 1873 was thinking about 1878. Why would they? The herds had always come back before. That confidence is the whole story in a way. It is why these places built nothing built to last, and everything built to move fast and make money now. The buildings were sod and green board, because sod and green board go up in a week. The wealth was hide and bone, because hide and bone can be loaded on a wagon by morning. Every choice these towns made was a bet that tomorrow would look like today. You would not have questioned it either. Standing there in that lantern light, breathing that thick animal air, listening to the hammer ring and the wagons creak. It looked like the start of something. Nobody there could have told you it was already the middle of the end. Picture your hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, still warm from a fire that burned all night. Around you, the camp is waking up. Men move between wagons like ants working a hill, and the smell of gunpowder hangs in the air like a second kind of weather. The buffalo hunters were not soldiers. They were not farmers either. They were something new, born out of a strange season in American history, when a single animal could make a man rich in one summer. Most came from nowhere in particular. Some had fought in the war and never found their way back to a normal life. Others were just boys who heard a rumor and followed it west with nothing but a rifle and a debt to pay off. Josiah Webb was one of them, though nobody remembers if that was his real name. The old accounts call him a hide man, one of hundreds who worked the southern herds near the Cimarron. He carried a Sharp's rifle heavy enough to break a man's shoulder if he was careless with it, and he was never careless with it. Folks said he could drop 50 animals before breakfast and never move his feet. He smelled like blood and tobacco and gun oil, and he did not apologize for any of it. Beside men like Josiah worked the skinners, and their job was worse than the shooting. They walked behind the fallen animals with knives long as a forearm, and by noon their arms were red to the elbow. Flies followed them in clouds thick enough to hear before you saw them. Their hands cracked and bled from the salt they rubbed into the hides. And still they kept working, because every hide meant money, and money was the only reason any of them were out there at all. Then came the traders. Picture a man like Elias Pruitt, though the sources give him a dozen different names, depending on which county recorded which memory. He rode a wagon loaded with coffee, cloth, tobacco, and whiskey, and he set up his post wherever the hunters gathered longest. His voice was smooth as riverstone, the kind of voice that made a bad trade sound generous. He knew every hunter's weakness before the hunter did, and he built his fortune on patience more than product. The camp itself moved like a small, restless town. Wagons formed loose streets. Tents leaned against each other for warmth. Children, too young to remember their birth states, ran between the fire pits, chasing dogs that had wandered in from 3 different territories. At night, someone always had a fiddle, and the music drifted out over the grass like smoke, thin and searching, until the dark swallowed it whole. Indigenous traders moved through these same spaces, and their presence complicates every story white settlers told about themselves. Kiowa and Comanche families had hunted these grounds for generations, before any hide man arrived with a rifle built up north. Some worked alongside the new arrivals, trading horses, meat, and knowledge of the land for goods they could not get any other way. Their relationship with the hunters was neither friendship nor war, but something more careful, built on need and watched closely by both sides. Elders in later generations spoke of this time not as a golden age, but as a warning already unfolding, one that few chose to hear. At the center of every camp stood the man who kept the numbers. Call him Otis Mercer, though history barely bothers to spell his name the same way twice. He weighed hides on an iron scale hung from a tripod, and he wrote in a ledger that would later vanish along with almost everything else. His fingers were always ink-stained. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon more than the page, as if he were counting something bigger than hides, something he could feel coming but could not yet name. You would have felt the rhythm of these days settle into your bones if you had lived among them. Mornings smelled of gun smoke and boiled coffee. Afternoons smelled of blood and hot leather. Evenings smelled of wood smoke and cheap whiskey. And under all of it, the endless grass, green in spring, gold in fall, moving like water in the wind. These people believed in their bones that the herds were endless. Why wouldn't they? The animals stretched to every horizon, morning after morning, as if the land itself was manufacturing them fresh each dawn. Nobody kept records of how fast the numbers dropped, because nobody thought they needed to. If you had stood among them in those years, you would have believed it too. The wealth felt too large, too constant, too written into the bones of the land itself to ever run dry. Picture yourself waking up in a town like this, sometime in the middle of it all. Your bed sits close to a canvas wall, thin as paper, and the morning sun comes through it orange and warm. Somewhere down the row, a dog barks at a wagon. Somewhere else, a woman calls a name that carries clean across the flat, quiet air, the way sound travels out here, when nothing tall stands in its way. You would smell the coffee before you smelled anything else. Every trading post ran on it, black and bitter, boiled twice over a low fire because good beans were dear, and nobody wasted a drop. Next came the smell of hides, always hides, stacked and drying, and turning the air thick with something between leather and dust and old blood, a smell that clung to your clothes so long you forgot it was there at all. Bacon grease popped in a pan somewhere close, bread baked in a tin oven, small and hard and better than nothing. The morning had a shape to it, the same shape every day. Traders walked the rows before the heat came up, checking their stacks of hides, counting what came in the night before. Skinners sharpened their knives on flat stones, a sound like a whisper repeated over and over, steady as a heartbeat. Freighters loaded wagons headed east, wheels groaning under the weight of buffalo robes piled higher than a man could reach. Children ran between the tents, chasing a dog or a hoop or nothing at all, because children run the same way in every world, boom or bust. By mid-morning, the trading post looked less like a camp and more like a small city standing on borrowed ground. Rows of canvas tents stretched in loose lines, some patched, some new and white as fresh snow, some the color of the dirt they sat in. A few men had built real structures, walls of sod or rough lumber hauled in on the last freight run, and those buildings stood out like teeth in the flat landscape, proof that somebody believed this place might last. Smoke rose from a dozen cook fires, thin grey threads, climbing into a sky so wide and so pale blue it swallowed the smoke whole before it ever reached a cloud. The store at the center of camp held everything a man needed, and plenty he didn't. Barrels of flour, coils of rope, bolts of cloth in colors too bright for the dust that covered everything, and rifles stacked behind the counter like firewood. The storekeeper knew every man's credit and every man's debt, kept it all in a ledger with a pencil worn down to a nub. He traded goods for hides on the promise that the hides were worth what everyone said they were worth, which was, for now, more than gold. You could feel that promise in the air, like a warmth you didn't question, the way you don't question the sun until it sets. At night, the camp turned soft and gold, lit by fires, and a few lanterns hung from tent poles, swinging gently when the wind moved through. Men gathered to talk prices and weather and the size of the last herd anyone had seen. Someone always had a fiddle, someone always played it badly, and nobody minded. Laughter carried the same way the woman's call had carried that morning, clean and far, out over grass that had no fences to stop it. If you had lived there, you would have believed in the rhythm of it. You would have believed the wagons would keep coming, that the hides would keep stacking, that the herds out on the grass were as endless as the sky above them. Nothing about the daily comfort of that place hinted at what was coming. The coffee still boiled. The dogs still barked. The fiddle still played its same 3 songs every night, and nobody thought to ask what would happen the day the herd simply didn't come. That is the part of the story people forget when they tell it fast. These were not desperate places clinging to nothing. They were full of small, warm, ordinary comforts, the kind that make a person feel settled, feel safe, feel like tomorrow will look just like today. Men sent letters home, describing a life that felt solid under their boots. Families believed a future was forming here, one hide at a time, one wagon at a time. You would have felt that same calm if you had stood among them. The dust would have settled warm under your feet. The smell of coffee and hide and wood smoke would have felt like home. And nothing at all, would have told you that the ground you stood on was already starting to disappear beneath you. Picture yourself walking into that bank on a bright morning in the 2nd year of the boom. The floor is real marble, hauled in on flat cars from a quarry 2 states away. Your boots click against it, sharp as a clock ticking, and the sound bounces off walls painted the color of fresh cream. A teller in a stiff collar counts bills with the calm of a man who believes the counting will never stop. This bank had a name that sounded like a promise. Some called it the First National, others just called it the Buffalo Bank, because everyone knew where the money came from. Hides came in by the wagon load, and credit went out just as fast, faster maybe, because the men behind the counter had convinced themselves the herds were as endless as the sky above them. You could walk in with nothing but a rifle and a story and walk out with enough paper to build a house. Nobody thought to ask what happened if the story stopped being true. That's the strange part historians still turn over today. The ledgers from these plains banks, the ones that survived fires and floods and time, show lending patterns that look less like business and more like faith. Loans went out against hides that hadn't been shot yet. Money moved on the promise of buffalo that were. At that very moment, wandering somewhere out past the horizon, alive and unaware they'd already been spent. A stranger showed up in one of these towns, the story goes, in the fall before the fall. Nobody remembers his name. He wore a coat too heavy for the season and carried a satchel that never left his hand. He sat in a corner of the saloon and asked quiet questions about how many hides had come through that month, and how many the year before that, and how many the year before that. He wrote the numbers down on a small pad, and when a rancher asked him straight out what he was doing, he only said, "Watching the count." Nobody knew what that meant. Some thought he worked for a hide company back east, checking on where all the money was really going. Others thought he was a buyer, scouting for competition. A few, later, when they had time to think back on it, wondered if he already knew something the rest of the town didn't. He left before winter, and nobody saw him arrive at any other town nearby, and nobody saw him leave on any train that kept a manifest. He was just a man who counted, and then he was gone. You can stand in the ruins of one of these old banks today, if you know where to look, and still see the outline of a teller's cage pressed faint into a crumbling wall. Dust sits thick on the floor now, thick as ash after a fire, and wind slips through the empty window frames with a low whistle, almost like breathing. If you press your palm against that cold stone, you can almost feel the weight of all that paper money that once moved through this room. Promises stacked on promises, each one leaning on the next like dominoes set up in a hurry. The bankers were not fools. They watched the same signs everyone else watched. The wagon trains rolling in heavy with hides, the new construction going up on every corner, the crowded platforms at the depot. From where they stood, the arithmetic looked sound. More hides meant more money. More money meant more credit. More credit meant more settlers, more stores, more reason to build the next building taller than the last. It was a story that kept confirming itself, right up until the day it didn't. Some researchers today believe the banks kept lending even after the first bad signs came in, because admitting trouble would have meant admitting the whole town was standing on nothing solid. Other researchers push back on that. They say the record shows real caution in some of these institutions, real efforts to slow the lending before the worst came. Both sides agree on one thing. Nobody in that bank, that bright morning with the marble floor and the clicking boots, believed the buffalo could simply stop. The stranger's pad of numbers was never found. No one knows if he took it east, or burned it, or lost it somewhere on the empty grass between towns that no longer show up on any map. If you stood in that bank on the day he walked out the door for the last time, you would have felt nothing unusual at all. Just the ordinary weight of an ordinary afternoon, the sun on the windows, the smooth, cold marble under your boots, and somewhere behind the counter, a man still counting money that had not yet and might never come. Sit at the general store counter, and you would hear the talk before you ever saw the trouble. The men who leaned there in the evenings did not need a bank ledger to tell them something was coming. They had their own ways of reading the world, and every one of them had a different answer for what the railroad meant. Old-timers spoke of the iron rail like a river that had learned to run backward before the tracks came. The hides moved slow, by wagon and by mule, and a man could feel the size of his own business in his own two hands. After the tracks came, the hides moved fast, and nobody could feel the size of anything anymore. The trains hauled off more buffalo skins in 1 week than 100 wagons could carry in a season, and the men at the counter said this with a kind of pride that had a crack running through the middle of it. You would have smelled tobacco smoke and coal oil in that store. Thick in the corners, where the lamps burned low, a man named Whitcomb, who had come out from Ohio with nothing but a rifle and a debt, liked to say the railroad was a gift from God to the plainsman. He said it loud, the way men say things they are trying hard to believe. Others just nodded and let their pipes go quiet, because agreeing costs nothing, and nobody wants to be the man who argues with hope. The women talked different, in the kitchens and on the church steps after Sunday service. They did not talk numbers. They talked about how many wagons rolled through in a week, how many strange faces sat down at supper, How the price of flour kept climbing even as the price of hides kept climbing too. One woman, whose name has not survived in any letter or diary, was remembered for saying that a town built on one animal was a town built on one prayer. If the prayer stopped, she said, so did the town. Nobody wrote that down at the time. It only came back later, passed mouth to mouth, the way true things sometimes do when nobody believed they mattered yet. The traders who had lived on these plains far longer than any rail line had a different memory entirely. Indigenous families who had followed the herds for generations, who had traded with white hunters and soldiers and merchants alike, watched the slaughter with an old and heavy knowing. They had seen herds thin before, seen them shift east or west, with a bad winter or a dry summer, and always the buffalo came back. But this felt different to them, and some elders said so plainly. The guns were too many, the wagons never stopped, the hides piled higher than a man could stand, and still there were more coming in. You would have heard this warning if you had sat close enough to listen, though most white settlers did not think to ask, and fewer still thought to write it down. That gap in the record is its own kind of silence, one that would echo for 100 years after the last buffalo skin left on the last train. What the old hunters knew, and what the new arrivals refused to believe, sat side by side in the same dust and never quite touched. At the tavern, the talk turned rougher and more hopeful in the same breath. Men bet on hide prices the way other men bet on horses. They swapped stories of hunters who had shot 400 buffalo in a single week and made more money than a farmer made in 3 years. They called it the biggest herd God ever put on this earth. Endless, unstoppable, a fortune with 4 legs and a heartbeat. Few of them stopped to ask what an endless herd would look like once it stopped being endless. Fewer still wanted to hear the answer. A preacher, a thin man with tired eyes, sometimes rose on Sunday and spoke of Job and the whirlwind, of fortunes built on sand instead of stone. His congregation nodded along politely and went home to count their profits anyway. Faith and greed sat in the same pew that year, close enough to share a hymnal, and nobody in that church could have told you which one would win. By the fire that night, if you had stayed to hear the last of the talk, you would have caught the quiet moment when the laughter died down and the men grew still. Someone always asked the same question in a different way. What happens when the herds move on for good? Nobody had an answer worth saying out loud. The wind outside picked up against the store's tin roof, rattling it soft and steady, like something far off, trying to get their attention. Picture yourself standing in a hide buyer's office in the fall of 1873. The ledger books are thick as Bibles, and the numbers in them still climb like they always have. Nobody in that room believes the climbing will ever stop. That belief is about to cost them everything. You have to go back further to understand what broke. Long before any trading post rose on these plains, the buffalo moved here, in numbers no one could count. Some tribes said the herds came up from a hole in the earth, born fresh each spring from the belly of the world. Others told of a great chief among the animals who decided each year where his people would walk. These were not just stories told for comfort. They were explanations for something that looked, to anyone standing in its path, like a force with no end. For the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and dozens of other nations, the herds had been the center of life for longer than memory could reach. Buffalo gave meat and hide and bone and sinew. A family could build an entire world from one animal. The relationship was not simple trade. It was older than trade, built on rules about respect and waste and gratitude that most white hunters and dealers never bothered to learn. Then, in a span of years that felt like an eye blink against that long history, everything changed. Railroads pushed west, and with them came a new machine for turning hide into money. Tanneries back east found a way to cure buffalo leather fast and cheap, perfect for machine belts and boot soles. A hide that once meant survival now meant cash in hand at a trading post window. The economics were staggering, and they moved faster than anyone could plan for. Picture the math the way a trader in 1874 might have seen it. A single hunter with a good rifle and a steady hand could drop 50 animals in a day. A skinning crew could process them before the meat even had time to spoil in the sun. One hide might fetch $3 at the post, more than a week's wages for most working men back east. Multiply that by the thousands of hunters who came, and you get a number too large to hold steady in the mind. Some counts put the slaughter at over 1 million animals a year. At the boom's peak, the trading posts that sprang up to handle this flood were not sleepy outposts. Some grew into small cities of canvas and green lumber, with saloons, general stores and boarding houses springing up around the hide yards. Men slept in shifts because the buildings could not hold them all. The smell of curing hide hung so thick over some camps that travelers said you could find the place with your eyes closed, a mile off, carried on the wind. But here is where the old stories and the new economy collided in a way nobody in the boom years wanted to see. The herds were not a well that refilled itself. They were finite, and they were already thinning by the time some of these posts went up. Indigenous hunters had known this for generations, had built customs around, not overhunting, around leaving enough for the herd to come back stronger. The new hunters did not know these customs, and mostly they did not care to learn. By the winter of 1878, in some parts of the southern plains, hunters who had shot 50 animals a day 2 years before could ride for a week and find nothing. The herds that had seemed endless simply were not there anymore. Some historians point to the sheer scale of the slaughter as the clear cause. Others argue the herds were already stressed by drought, by disease carried in from cattle, by a changing climate on the plains that nobody tracked closely enough to prove. The truth may be some tangle of all three, and no ledger book from that time gives a clean answer. What is certain is what happened next to the men who had built their lives on the hide trade. The buyers stopped buying because there was nothing left to buy. The posts that had grown fat on endless supply found their whole reason for existing gone in a single season. Some accounts describe boom towns that had thousands of residents shrinking to a few dozen within a year, the buildings left standing empty like teeth in an old jaw. You would have felt that turn in the air before anyone said it aloud. The hide yards go quiet, the wagons stop rolling in from the range, and the wind starts moving through empty streets that, only months before, had rung with the sound of money being made. You would have felt the cold first if you had walked into that county courthouse basement. Concrete floors, a single bulb hanging from a wire, boxes stacked to the ceiling. Most of them never opened since the day someone carried them down there and forgot. That is where a woman named Ruth Castellan started looking back in the 1970s. She was not a historian. She taught 4th grade in a town 40 miles east, and she had grown up hearing her grandmother talk about a place called Bonham Crossing, a buffalo trading post that was supposed to have 3,000 people in it at its peak. Ruth Wanted to find it on a map. She could not. Not on any map printed after 1878. So she went looking in the boxes, county land records they call them. Deeds, tax rolls, survey notes written in pencil by men who rode out on horseback and wrote down what they saw. Ruth expected to find Bonham Crossing listed somewhere, even if just as a line item, a name with a number next to it. She found nothing. Not one deed, not one tax record, not one mention in any government paper filed before the buffalo herds vanished. That is the thing that surprised her most, and it is the thing that surprises almost everyone who goes looking. These trading posts, the ones that supposedly held thousands of people and did more business in a season than some cities did in a year, were often never surveyed at all. No one platted the streets, no one filed the town with a territory. They existed the way a campfire exists, real while it burns. Gone once it is out, with nothing left to prove it was ever there. Ruth found a partial answer in an old newspaper archive. 2 counties over, a paper called the Frontier Index that folded in 1879. One reporter, whose name history did not bother to keep, had ridden through Bonham Crossing on assignment and written 4 paragraphs about it. He described plank buildings, a saloon with a mirror shipped in from St. Louis, and hide wagons lined up for a quarter mile, waiting to unload. He called it, in his own words, a city that sprang up between 2 sunrises. 4 paragraphs. That is the entire written record of a place some old-timers swore held more people than the county seat. You start to understand, sitting with that kind of silence, why so many of these places refuse to show up in any official story. The territorial government had no reason to survey a hide camp. It was not incorporated. It paid no taxes, because there was no authority collecting them. The men and women who lived there did not think of themselves as founding a permanent town. They thought of themselves as working a boom, the same way a person today might work a harvest season, and then move on when the work ran out. Some researchers argue that is the whole answer, plain and simple. No survey, no deed, no permanent structure, no record. Case closed. But others push back on that, and they have a point worth sitting with. Fort Griffin, over in Texas, was a real buffalo hide town, and had left behind plenty. Foundations, photographs, a cemetery you can still visit today. So why did some hide camps leave ruins you can stand inside, and others leave nothing at all? Not even a foundation stone to trip over. Ruth's own theory, the one she wrote down in a spiral notebook she kept for 30 years, was construction. Fort Griffin and towns like it were built to last at least a little while, with lumber hauled in and buildings meant to hold through a few winters. Places like Bonham Crossing, she believed, were built from whatever was closest and cheapest. Green lumber, canvas, sod, buffalo hide stretched over frames, built to shelter a season, not to survive one. When the herds moved on and the people followed, there was nothing sturdy enough left behind to fossilize into ruin. The plains simply took it back. It is a theory, not a proof. No one has ever found a full site plan for Bonham Crossing, or a photograph, or a single foundation that historians agree belonged to it. Ruth spent decades looking, and never found the ground itself, only the outline of its absence. 4 paragraphs in a dead newspaper, and a name that lived only in her grandmother's mouth. If you had stood beside her in that courthouse basement, running your fingers over box after box of paper that held every ordinary detail of frontier life, except the one town she wanted, you would have felt exactly what she felt. Not fear, something quieter, the strange hollow weight of looking for a place that everyone remembered and no one had bothered to write down. If you had walked the main street of one of these towns in its last year, you would have felt the strange weight of two truths sitting side by side. The storefronts still had glass in the windows. The graveyard still had fresh dirt on top of it. Both of those things were true at once, and nobody wanted to say out loud what that meant. An old letter survives from a woman named Clara Voss, written to her sister back in Ohio. She does not give her town's name, and historians have never matched her words to a place on any map. She writes that the general store closed on a Tuesday, and by Thursday somebody had already pried the shelves off the walls to use the wood for a coffin. That is the kind of detail that sticks with you, not the failure of the business, the speed of what came after it. Her letter, says the preacher, buried 4 people in 11 days that winter, and none of them died from anything you could point to. She writes, "The doctor said their hearts simply stopped wanting to keep going. Whether that is grief or fever or something else, nobody can say now. Clara herself left before spring. She does not say where she went. The letter just ends." You can find similar accounts scattered through diaries and old newspaper clippings from Kansas and Nebraska, each one a little different, each one circling the same feeling. A man named Otis Reams, who worked loading hides onto rail cars, wrote a short memoir late in his life. He remembered the smell of the place before anything else: curing hides, wood smoke, the iron tang of blood from the skinning yards. Then he remembered the smell just stopping. 1 month you could not breathe without tasting the trade, he wrote. The next month the wind came through clean, and clean felt like the worst thing I ever smelled. That detail repeats itself in account after account. Not fire, not flood, just quiet, and the strange way quiet can feel louder than noise. A rancher's daughter, interviewed decades later for a local history project in the 1970s, remembered her father walking the empty lot where the hotel used to be. She said he stood there a long time, not talking, just turning his hat in his hands. She asked him what he was looking for. He told her, "Nothing. That is the trouble. There is nothing left to look for." You feel that same trouble reading these accounts back to back. The stores are empty, but the graves keep filling. People do not run from a town that is simply poor. People run from a town that feels wrong. And grief alone does not usually explain that kind of running. Some historians point to disease, the kind that spreads fast through crowded, poorly built boom towns, with no real water system and no real doctor. That is the practical answer, and it likely explains a share of the deaths. Cholera and typhoid did not care whether a town had a bright future, but other researchers push back gently on that theory, noting how many of these accounts describe healthy people simply giving up, packing a wagon in the middle of the night, leaving supper on the table. That is not the shape sickness usually takes. That is the shape of something closer to despair, or perhaps something closer to instinct, a body sensing collapse before the mind can put words to it. A cattleman named Ezra Coates left behind a short account, more list than story, found tucked in a family Bible. He wrote the names of 5 families who left his town in a single week, and beside each name he wrote where they said they were going. Not one of those 5 destinations matches a town that still exists today. He adds a line at the bottom, almost an afterthought. None of them arrived where they meant to. No explanation, no follow-up. Just that sentence, sitting there like a stone at the bottom of a creek. If you had stood in that cattleman's boots, watching wagon after wagon roll west, past a hotel with its doors standing open, you might have felt the same thing he felt. Not fear exactly, something quieter than fear. The sense that a place can hollow out faster than anyone can explain, and that the people leaving know something the people staying do not. These voices do not agree on a cause. They agree on a feeling, and feeling is often the only record a vanished town leaves behind. The storefronts stayed standing for a while, empty glass catching the light, like something still open for business. The graveyards kept their fences mended long after the houses around them fell in on themselves. Somewhere between those two facts, in the space no letter quite fills, the real story of these towns still waits to be believed. You would have seen him first if you had ridden into that county in the last days. A thin man in a black coat, standing on a porch that no longer had a store behind it. His name gets remembered differently in every account, but the shape of him never changes. He was the preacher who would not leave by the time the herds thinned and the hide buyers stopped coming. Most of these little hunting towns had already started their slow bleed east, wagons left in 2s and 3s, then in whole lines that stretched to the horizon, like dark thread pulled loose from cloth. But in town after town, in story after story, one man stayed behind. He kept the church open. He rang the bell on Sunday mornings for a congregation that grew smaller every week, until it was just him and the wind and the sound of his own voice bouncing off empty pews. Old letters from 3 different counties describe almost the same man, a minister who believed the town would come back. He told the last families not to worry, that the buffalo would return the way they always had, that this was only a hard season and not an ending. You can hear the same words repeated in diaries from Kansas, from the Texas Panhandle, from the Dakota country, written by people who never met each other and never read each other's pages. The preacher who stayed too long becomes a kind of ghost that shows up again and again, like a figure sewn into the same quilt pattern, town after town. Some folklorists think this is simple coincidence. Frontier preachers were common, and hope is a common thing to preach. A man of faith telling his flock to hold on is not a mystery. It is just his job. But others notice something stranger in the pattern. The dates line up too closely. The sermons, when they survive in fragments, use almost identical language about waiting on the Lord's providence and trusting that the herds were only resting, not gone. Whole passages read as if one preacher had written them for every town at once, though no single man could have been in all those pulpits. Maybe the answer is simpler than a mystery. Maybe frontier ministers traded circulars and printed sermons the way farmers traded seed catalogues, copying the same comforting words, because comfort was in short supply. Paper moved along the same rail lines that carried the hides out. A hopeful sermon written in one town could ride the same freight car to another, get read from a different pulpit, and comfort a different room of frightened families. That would explain the echo, without needing anything stranger than ink and rail track. But there is a detail that keeps surfacing in family letters, one that resists such a tidy explanation. In more than one town, the preacher who stayed is remembered as the last man seen before the settlement went fully quiet. Not the last to leave, the last to be seen. After him, no one has an account of who shut the church door, or who took the bell down, or who locked the schoolhouse. He simply appears in the record, and then does not appear again, and no grave marks his ending in any of these towns. If you walk the cracked foundation of a plains church today, the dust under your boots holds no bones and no headstone, only the outline of a floor. Some believe these men simply moved on quietly and were forgotten, the way most drifting ministers of that era were forgotten, without any grave, because they left no family behind to build one. Others hold on to a gentler thought passed down through oral memory, that the preacher stayed because the town needed one person to close its eyes for it, the way a family sits with someone in their last hours. In that telling, he is not a mystery to solve. He is a kindness, the last human voice a dying town heard before the wind took over completely. Whatever the truth of him, his story appears wherever these towns disappeared. The same coat, the same bell, the same stubborn hope against a commodity that was never coming back. If you stood in one of those roofless churches at dusk, with grass pushing up through the floorboards, and the sky turning the color of a bruise over the empty street outside, you might understand why the story keeps repeating. A pattern this consistent starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a shape the plains themselves keep drawing over and over in dust and silence and abandoned pews. You would feel it settle into your chest like cold air through a broken window, this sense that you were standing exactly where he once stood, waiting for people who were never coming home. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a county in the fall of 1885. You would feel the wind first, dry and steady, moving through grass that had already turned the color of old rope. There is no sound but that wind, and maybe a hawk somewhere, calling once and then quitting. Every farmhouse around you has its curtains drawn, not locked up tight against a storm, just closed, quiet, like the people meant to come back for supper and never did. This is the part of the story that folks who study the buffalo trade come back to again and again, because it is not one town falling. It is a whole county falling at once, like a row of dominoes that somebody set up years before without knowing what they were building. The plains did not lose one trading post that autumn. County records from Kansas and the Texas Panhandle, thin as they are, suggest a dozen small settlements went dark inside 18 months of each other. A trapper's post here, a hide yard there, a rail depot town with 300 souls, one spring, and by the next spring, maybe 30. The story goes like this, and it gets told the same way in a dozen counties from the Arkansas River down through the Cimarron country. The buffalo herds that fed the hide trade did not shrink slowly. They did not fade like a candle burning down. They simply stopped where they should have been. Hunters who had ridden the same routes for 6 seasons rode out one October and found nothing. No herds crossing the river bottoms. No dust cloud on the horizon that meant 1,000 animals moving together. Just grass and silence and the wind doing all the talking. Nobody had a plan for that silence. That is the piece that historians keep circling back to, because it explains so much of what came after. The hide trade had grown so fast and paid so well that towns built themselves around a single promise. Hunters believed the herds would always come. Merchants believed the hunters would always sell. Bankers believed the merchants would always need credit, and railroads believed there would always be hides to haul east. Every layer of that town depended on the layer below it, and every layer below it depended on animals nobody controlled and nobody could count. When the herds did not come, the hunters had no herds to hunt. When the hunters had no hides, the merchants had no goods. When the merchants had no goods, the bank had no repayments. And when the bank had no repayments, the bank simply closed its door one grey morning and did not open it again. Some accounts say a single bank failure in the winter of 1886 set off the whole chain, spreading from post to post along the rail lines, faster than any letter could travel. Other historians push back hard on that telling. They argue the collapse had already started years earlier, quietly, the way a fence post rots from the inside before it ever falls. What almost everyone agrees on is the speed of what followed. Families who had put down roots, built sod houses, planted gardens they expected to harvest for 20 years, packed what fit on a wagon, and left inside a season. Some newspapers from the period call it an exodus, though that word feels too grand for what neighbors actually saw. It was quieter than that. It was one wagon leaving, and then another, until the road out of town carried more traffic than the road in. You can still find county plat maps from 1884, showing streets, churches, a schoolhouse, sometimes 40 or 50 platted lots, ready for buyers. Cross-reference those same coordinates against the 1900 census, and in more than a few cases, there is nothing there at all. No town, no people. Sometimes, not even a name that matches, as if the place had been quietly erased from the paperwork, along with the buildings. Some researchers believe the departures were more planned than legend admits, families moving in stages, taking what they could sell first, and settling debts before they left. Others hold to the version passed down through families themselves, the one where a whole town seemed to vanish inside a single hard winter, as if the wind itself had swept it clean. If you had walked those same roads in the years right after, you would have felt that same wind on your face, and heard that same silence settle over ground that had held streets and dreams and a fortune nobody thought could disappear that fast. If you had walked into that farmhouse outside Cimarron in the spring of 1887, you would have felt the cold come off the walls before you saw a single thing inside. The door hung open on one hinge. Dust sat thick on the sill, like a grey blanket someone had forgotten to shake out, and on the table, in the middle of the front room, 4 plates still waited, 4 forks, 4 cups, tipped just slightly, like hands had let go of them mid-motion. This is the detail that follows this story wherever it gets told. Not the empty bank, not the broken storefronts, this house and its table set for a meal that never happened. The family who lived there raised cattle and sold hides when the buffalo still ran thick enough to matter. Their name shows up in a county ledger once, spelled 2 different ways, and then it does not show up again. Neighbors who passed through months later found the house standing open to the weather, the way you'd find a barn door left loose, chairs pulled out, a pot on the cold stove, with something long since turned to dust inside it. Nothing broken, nothing burned, nothing stolen, as far as anyone could tell, though there was little left worth stealing by then anyway. You can stand in a place like that, even now if you found the right stretch of land, and feel the strangeness of it settle into your shoulders. A house does not get abandoned like that, not usually. People leave in a hurry when there is fire, or flood, or soldiers coming. They leave slow when there is drought, when the well runs dry a little more each year, and the decision creeps up on them. Both kinds of leaving show signs. Fire leaves ash, slow leaving leaves packed wagons, sold furniture, a trail of what people chose to keep and what they didn't. This house showed neither. The story passed down says the family heard the buffalo were gone, truly gone, the herds that had fed them and paid them and given the whole county its reason for existing. And the story says they simply stopped, mid-meal, mid-life, as if news like that could stop a person's hands in place the way winter stops a river. Nobody who tells this story claims to know exactly what happened to that family. Some versions send them east, back to whatever place they came from before the hide trade pulled them west. Some versions are quieter than that and darker in the corners, though nobody who repeats them will say much more than that. The land around Chimaron swallowed a lot of families whole during the collapse. Most left some trace, a grave, a letter, a cousin who remembered the leaving. This family left a table, a writer who came through the county decades later, gathering stories for a small regional paper, found an old-timer willing to talk about the house. He said his own father had seen it standing that way for years before it finally fell in on itself. He said nobody in town ever moved to clean it out, though plenty could have used the wood, the plates, the iron stove. He said folks were superstitious about it, the way people get superstitious about things they cannot explain with the ordinary tools of explaining. Better to leave it be than to ask what happened at that table. You could call this a piece of frontier folklore, sanded and shaped by 100 retellings, the kind of detail that grows sharper every time it changes hands. That is probably true, at least in part. Stories about sudden vanishing dot the whole history of the plains, and not every one of them needs a supernatural reading. Sometimes a family simply left in the night, embarrassed by debt, and let the neighbors imagine the rest. Fear fills in details that fact leaves empty, and a table set for a meal makes for a better story than a family quietly walking away from their bills. But the collapse of the buffalo economy did move fast enough to catch people exactly like that, frozen between one version of their life and the next. Herds that had fed thousands of hunters and traders for a generation thinned to nothing in the space of a few seasons. Word did not travel evenly. Some families heard the news early and planned their leaving. Others heard it too late, or not at all, until the wagons stopped coming and the buyers stopped buying, and the whole reason for staying simply evaporated around them. Whatever happened at that table, the detail has outlived the family's name. It has outlived the county ledger that misspelled them twice. If you had stood in that doorway with the dust settling on your boots, you would have understood why nobody in town wanted to touch the plates. Stand in the wind on that empty ground long enough, and you start hearing arguments instead of ghosts. That is what the historians brought here. Not lanterns, not dowsing rods, just a stack of papers, and a hard, patient doubt that refuses to bend just because a story feels good. Their case is simple, and it is not foolish. Trading posts on the plains were built fast and built cheap. Green lumber, canvas roofs, sod walls that melted back into the ground the moment nobody shoveled the mud away from them. A structure like that does not need a mystery to disappear. It needs one wet spring and 20 years of nobody caring. The skeptics will tell you that erasure is not evidence of anything strange. Erasure is just what time does to anything built in a hurry, on land nobody owned long enough to protect it. They point to the buffalo hide business itself, and here they have real ground to stand on. The hide trade ran on nothing but speed and appetite. Runners rode out, shot fast, skinned fast, and moved camp before the smell of rot caught up with them. A post that served that kind of economy was never meant to last. It was meant to serve one season, maybe two, before the herds shifted or the buyers stopped coming. Call it what it was, they say. Not a lost city, a loading dock with delusions of permanence. And the paper trail backs them up more than the legend wants you to admit. Government surveyors mapped railroads. They mapped forts. They mapped land offices and county seats where taxes could be collected and votes could be counted. A hide camp, run half by white traders and half by Cheyenne or Comanche families, moving with the herd, answering to nobody's court and nobody's ledger, had no reason to appear on any federal map at all. Of course, it left no record, the skeptics say. It was never meant to be recorded. You are not looking at a vanished town. You are looking at a place that was never officially there to begin with. Even the human remains get a colder reading from this side of the fire. Bodies buried in shallow ground, wrapped in canvas instead of coffins, will not survive a century of frost heave and plough blade. Bones scatter. Markers rot. What looks like a mass grave with no explanation might just be a normal graveyard that lost its fence, its church, and its living memory all at the same time. Sad, they admit, not sinister. You can stand where these arguments were made and feel how reasonable they sound, laid out flat and dry as the ground itself. There is comfort in an explanation that needs no mystery at all. But even the skeptics slow down at one thing: the volume, because this was not one post. It was not 2 or 3, tucked into different corners of the plains, each with its own tidy explanation. Survey teams and later researchers found the outlines of dozens of these camps across a stretch of prairie that should have kept better memory than this. Some were large enough to have held hundreds of people at once, based on the scatter of tent rings and cook fires still faintly visible from the air in the right season, at the right slant of light. That scale is hard to wave away as a handful of forgotten loading docks. And the timing bothers even the most careful doubters. These places did not fade out one by one, at different speeds, for different local reasons. Wood samples, ash layers, the rare surviving trade receipt. All of it points to the same narrow window, a handful of years, right around the final collapse of the great herds, when dozens of camps across hundreds of miles seem to have gone quiet at almost the same time. That is not the shape of ordinary decay. Ordinary decay is slow and uneven. This looks like something closer to a single held breath, let out all at once. Across an entire stretch of country, the skeptics will still tell you there is nothing supernatural in that. A shared collapse has a shared cause, they say, and the cause is simple economics. The buffalo vanished, so the money vanished, so the people vanished. No ghosts required. They may be right about the mechanism. Almost certainly they are right about the mechanism, but even they cannot fully explain the silence that followed. Why so little was ever found, where so much once stood. Why the ground kept its secrets so completely, even from people who came looking with shovels and good intentions. Stand there today, boots in the same dust, and you can hear both arguments at once. The dry, sensible one that explains everything except the scale of it, and the older one, quieter, that never needed an explanation to begin with. Picture yourself standing on a wooden platform, the boards soft with rot under your boots, waiting for a train that will never come again. That is where the old-timers say the last true believers stood, not believers in ghosts, believers in a number, a price per hide that hung in the air of these towns, like a promise nobody could see, but everyone trusted anyway. The people who lived through the collapse did not need convincing that something strange had happened to them. They had watched it happen with their own eyes. An old woman in Dodge City, interviewed decades later by a local historian, said she remembered the exact week the buyers stopped coming. She was a girl then, maybe 9 or 10. She said the wagons that used to line up outside her father's trading post just stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. Like a clock somebody forgot to wind. She did not doubt her own memory, and she did not care if city folks believed her. That is the mark of a true believer in this story. Not someone chasing a ghost, someone who lived inside a number until the number betrayed them. You would have felt that same stillness if you had waited on that platform with her. The wind would have come first, dry and grainy, carrying the smell of dust and old rope. Then the silence would have settled in, thick as a wool blanket pulled over the whole town. No whistle, no smoke on the horizon, just flat land stretching out grey and endless, and the sound of your own breath in your ears. The believers in this story are not the ones who saw a spirit walk through a wall. They are the ranchers' children who grew old holding on to receipts nobody else wanted to look at. Faded paper, ink gone brown, numbers that once meant a fortune. One family in western Kansas kept a ledger for 3 generations, just to prove that their grandfather's post had done real business, real trade, right up until the day it didn't. They did not need anyone to believe them either. They just needed the ledger to survive as long as they did. There is a cost to holding on to a memory nobody wants to hear anymore. Some of these families were laughed at by later generations, who saw only crumbling foundations and empty lots where a boom town used to stand. Neighbors called them dreamers, chasing ghosts of glory days that maybe never existed at all. But they kept talking anyway, because somebody had to remember the platform, the wagons, the buyers who came from as far as St. Louis and Chicago, just for hides. What did they gain by speaking up? Not money, not fame. What they gained was a kind of peace, the kind that comes from saying out loud what your own eyes saw, even if the world moved on without you. An old trapper's daughter in Nebraska once told a folklorist that she did not need the county records to prove her father's post had thrived. She said the records could burn. She still knew what she smelled in that country, the tang of blood and smoke, the low bellow of animals stretching to the edge of sight. She said no ledger could hold that. Only a person could. That kind of certainty does not fit neatly into a textbook. Historians want documents, deeds, tax rolls, something they can hold in their hands. But the believers in this story hold something different. They hold a felt truth, the weight of a town that used to hum with life, now gone quiet as a held breath. You cannot dig that up with a shovel. You can only hear it if you sit still long enough and let somebody old enough to remember start talking. Some researchers push back on this kind of testimony. Memory bends with time, they say. A child's impression of a busy trading post might swell bigger in the retelling, the wagons multiplying with each passing decade, the riches growing shinier the longer the town has been gone. That is a fair caution. Nobody's memory is a photograph. But even the skeptics admit something real sits underneath these stories, something the paper trail alone cannot explain. The speed of the collapse, the totality of the silence, the fact that a place could hold 1,000 souls one autumn and stand hollow by spring. If you had stood at that platform with the old woman from Dodge City, you would not have needed a single official record to know something enormous had ended. You would have felt it in the emptiness of the tracks, in the way the grass had already started creeping back over ground that used to be packed hard by boots and wheels. She believed her own eyes. So did the family with the ledger. So did the trapper's daughter, who trusted her nose over any archive. None of them needed the world to agree. They just needed somebody, someday, to listen. Stand in that field long enough, and the ground will tell you something the papers never could. Walk the old town site today, out past the county road, where the wheat gives way to buffalo grass, and you will feel it under your boots before you see it. The earth dips in long rectangles, shallow as a sleeping man's breath, where sellers once sat under buildings that burned or fell or simply walked away on the backs of wagons. Nothing grows quite right there. The grass comes in thinner, paler, like it remembers being asked to hold up something heavy, Ranchers in that county will tell you the same thing, generation after generation, without ever comparing notes. They will tell you their cattle do not graze near the old foundation lines. Not out of fear, they always say, careful with the word, just habit. Like the cows know something the men do not. You can stand at the fence and watch it happen. The herd drifts wide around a patch of ground no bigger than a house and grazes right up to its edge, and no closer, and nobody living can tell you why. The trees hold their own record too. A line of cottonwoods grows along what used to be the town's main street, planted by hands that are long gone to dust, and they grow crooked in a way cottonwoods do not usually grow. Wind bends most trees, one direction, the direction the weather comes from. These trees lean toward each other, toward the center of the street, like men who died mid-conversation and never got to finish. A forester came through in the 1970s and took photographs, put them in a small university paper. Nobody read. He had no explanation. He only had the pictures. The river tells its own version of the story, and rivers on the plains are notorious liars, changing their beds every few decades like a man who cannot stay in one bed himself. The creek that once ran behind the grain elevator moved almost a quarter-mile east sometime in the early part of the last century. Maps from before the collapse show water running past the back doors of the depot and the hotel. Maps from 20 years later show dry ground there, and the water gone somewhere else entirely, carving a new channel through what used to be someone's wheat field. Old-timers had a saying about that. They said the river left town the same year the people did, like it had heard the same news and made the same decision. It is a bit of poetry more than a fact, the kind of line a grandfather tells a grandson on a porch in August, but it carries a truth in it that the surveys never captured. Something in that place stopped holding together all at once. Not just the people, not just the buildings. Even the water seemed to lose interest in staying. Foundations from the old buildings will not hold today, and men who have tried to build there know it firsthand. 3 different owners over the decades have tried to put something up on that ground. A barn, a shed, once a small house for a hired hand, and every single structure has settled wrong within a few years. Cracks open in the concrete like dry lips. Doors stop closing right. One family gave up entirely and moved their shed 40 yards south onto ground that had never held a building before, and it has stood plumb and solid for 30 years since. The old man who built it only shrugged when asked why he moved it. Some ground don't want you there, he said. That was the whole answer he ever gave. Soil scientists have their own quieter theory, and it does not require ghosts or grudges from the earth itself. The original town sat on ground churned up by decades of buffalo hide processing, of chemicals and lime and animal fat worked into the dirt by boot heels and wagon wheels, until the soil itself was something other than plain prairie ground. That kind of earth settles differently for a century or more. It holds water, strange. It shifts when it should not. There is nothing supernatural required, they say, only chemistry and time working the way chemistry and time always work. But chemistry does not explain why the cattle drift wide of that same ground 100 years later, when whatever was in that soil should be long gone by now. It does not explain the cottonwoods leaning inward, or the river's sudden change of heart. Maybe the land only remembers in its own language, one that does not translate easily into a laboratory report. If you walked that field tonight, under a sky gone the color of a bruise, at dusk, the wind would move through that dry grass with a sound almost like breathing, and you would not be able to say for certain that the ground beneath you had forgotten anything at all. Picture yourself standing on a plain somewhere in western Kansas, and you feel it before you understand it. The wind stops carrying the sound of anything human. No dog barks, no wagon wheel creaks. That kind of quiet has a weight to it, like a hand pressed flat against your chest. And the people who lived through these vanishings all describe it the same way, no matter where they stood when it happened. This is not the only town that went quiet like this. Across the plains, in the decades after the buffalo herds broke apart, other places suffered the same fate, and the pattern shows up again and again if you know where to look. A trading post in the Texas Panhandle called Adobe Walls thrived for a few short years on hide money, then emptied out so fast that when travelers passed through later, they found crates of unopened goods still sitting on the shelves. Nobody knows exactly why the merchants left everything behind. Some say fear. Some say the money simply stopped being worth the weight of carrying it. Up in Nebraska, along the Republican River, a hunting camp called Buffalo Station rose out of nothing in 1872. Feeding a rail line hungry for hides, newspapers wrote about it like it might grow into a real city. Within 4 years it was gone so completely that surveyors sent out later to map the county could not agree on where it had even stood. You can search for it today and find 3 different dots on 3 different maps, each one claiming to be the true spot, and each one probably wrong. The theory that ties these places together is simple enough to say out loud, even if it is hard to prove. Wherever the buffalo economy touched down, it built towns with no foundation under them, no second crop, no backup trade to keep the lights on when the herds thinned. A gold town could always dig deeper. A farming town could always plant something else. But a hide town lived and died by an animal that moved on its own schedule, an animal that answered to nothing and no one. And when it stopped coming, there was nothing left to stand on. Historians who study this pattern point to the numbers, and the numbers are almost too clean to be comfortable. Hide shipments out of the plains dropped by more than 90% in less than 5 years during the 1870s. That is not a slow decline. That is a cliff. Whole rail depots that had once loaded boxcar after boxcar of hides sat empty within a single season, and the men who ran them had no warning worth mentioning. No gentle slope down, just a sudden and total stop. But not everyone agrees on how much of the disappearing was economic and how much was something else entirely. Some old-timers and their descendants tell a different version of these stories, one that puts less faith in numbers and more faith in the land itself. They say certain places on the plains were never meant to hold people for long, that the ground under a hide camp or a trading post carried a kind of restlessness passed down from the herds themselves. You can hear this in stories from Osage and Kiowa communities, who watched white hunters build these towns on land the buffalo had always used only briefly, moving through rather than staying. To them, the towns falling apart so fast was not a mystery at all. It was the land simply going back to what it had always been. Skeptics push back against that reading, and they have a point worth hearing. Economics alone can explain a lot. When a market collapses that fast, people do not linger to see if it recovers. They load what they can carry and go find the next opportunity, the same way boomtown miners did when a vein of silver ran dry. There is nothing supernatural about a merchant cutting his losses. There is nothing eerie about an empty depot if you already know the freight stopped coming. And yet the stories keep circling back to that same detail over and over in town after town. Tables set for meals nobody ate, crates never opened, a silence that fell overnight instead of over years. If it were only economics, you would expect a slow fade, a town shrinking house by house as families gave up and left. Instead, witnesses across hundreds of miles describe something closer to a held breath finally being let go all at once. Stand in the middle of any of these old town sites today, out where the grass has grown back over the wagon ruts, and you will not find a marker or a monument. You will find wind and grass, and maybe a fence post leaning at an angle nobody bothered to straighten. Whatever emptied these places, it moved through the whole region like weather, and it left the same kind of quiet behind wherever it passed. Stand at the edge of a wheat field in western Kansas, and you might feel your boot catch on something hard under the soil. Reach down, brush away the dirt, and you could pull up a rusted bolt the size of your fist. That bolt once held together a grain elevator. The elevator once held the promise of a town that does not exist anymore. The grain elevators are the closest thing these lost places left behind. Wood rots. Canvas tents rot faster, but iron holds its shape even after the men who forged it are gone. Across the high plains, farmers still turn up these fragments in their fields, tangled in roots, half swallowed by grass. Each one is a small, stubborn piece of a bigger structure that once touched the sky. You can picture what stood above that bolt. A grain elevator in a Buffalo boomtown could rise 60 feet into the air, a tower of raw lumber standing over a sea of grass like a lighthouse with no ocean. Farmers hauled wagons of wheat toward it from 20 miles out, hoping the railroad car waiting below would carry their harvest to a price that made the whole gamble worth it. For a few years, that tower was the tallest thing between the horizon and the sun. Now picture the same spot with nothing there at all. The wood is gone. The tracks are gone. Even the raised earth where the rail bed sat has softened back into the shape of the land around it, worn down by 100 years of rain and frost. If you did not know to look for the bolt, you would walk right over the whole town and never feel it under your feet. Photographs help fill in what the ground cannot show you. A handful of glass plate images survive from these settlements, taken by traveling photographers who charged a few coins for a portrait in front of a false front store. Look closely at the background of one such photograph, taken outside a trading post in the Texas Panhandle around 1877, and you will see something the photographer likely never noticed. Behind the row of hide buyers, standing stiff and serious, a second row of wagons sits half-loaded as if someone stopped mid-departure to watch the camera work. Historians still argue about what those wagons mean. Some say it was simple timing, a delivery caught between stops. Others believe it shows the town already thinning out, the exodus beginning even as the picture was taken. Letters offer a different kind of proof, quieter but just as strange. A merchant's wife in a Kansas trading post wrote to her sister in Ohio in the winter of 1878, describing a town so full of hope that the church held 2 services just to fit the crowd. 8 months later, her next surviving letter opens with a single line. She writes that there is no one left to preach to. She does not explain what happened between those 2 letters. She does not need to. The silence between the paper does more work than the words on it. Some artifacts raise more questions than they answer. In the 1960s, a rancher plowing a field near the old Adobe Walls trading grounds struck a buried crate of tin cans, still sealed, still stacked, the way a shopkeeper would have stacked them on a shelf. The cans held preserved peaches, untouched for 8 decades. Nobody has ever explained why an entire crate of goods was buried rather than sold, packed rather than left in the open. One theory says the owner meant to come back for them, another says the ground simply swallowed a storage pit that time forgot to erase. You could hold one of these tin cans in your hand today, feel the cold metal and the strange weight of history in your palm, and still not know the answer. That is the nature of everything pulled from this ground. Every object tells you a town was here. Very few of them tell you why the town left in such a hurry, or why so little of it remains for you to find. The rust on an old bolt, the wagons frozen in a photograph, a widow's letter cut short, a crate of peaches buried like a secret. None of it forms a full picture. All of it points toward the same missing piece, the same abandoned pause in the middle of a boom that never got its ending written down. If you knelt in that wheat field long enough, turning the bolt over in your fingers, you might feel the whole prairie holding its breath around you, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. If you sat at a Nebraska kitchen table long enough, sooner or later somebody would bring up the man who wouldn't leave. Every family that traces its roots back to these buffalo towns seems to carry a version of him, a great-grandfather, an uncle, a name half remembered. He stayed behind when the herds broke apart and the buyers stopped coming. He stayed after everyone else had loaded their wagons and gone. You can hear the story told 100 different ways, but the shape of it never changes much. A man stands in an empty trading post, alone, while the wind pulls at the canvas walls around him. He tells the last wagon to go on without him. He says the herds will come back. He says the buyers will remember this place. He says someone has to be here when the money returns, in the Kansas version. His name is Whitcomb, and he ran a hide-scraping operation that once employed 40 men. In the version told around Dodge City, he has no name at all. He is just the old buyer, or the man at the crossing. Some families insist he was a trader who married into a Cheyenne or Arapaho family and refused to abandon people who had nowhere else sanctioned to go. Others say he was simply stubborn, the kind of man who could not accept that a fortune built on grass and hooves could vanish faster than it arrived. What matters is not whether he existed exactly as the story says. What matters is what the story is trying to hold on to. Every collapsed economy needs a symbol, one figure who stands in for the disbelief that the good times are really over. He is the town's stubbornness, wearing a human face. He is what happens when hope outlasts the thing it was hoping for. If you had walked past his post in the months after the bust, you would have found the door still open and the scales for weighing hides still hanging from their post. You would have seen dust gathering on ledgers that once tracked thousands of dollars a week. You would have felt the particular quiet of a place built for commerce that no longer has anything to sell. Families who trace their line back to these towns often disagree on how his story ends. In some tellings, he dies there, alone, and is found months later by a passing rider. In others, he simply disappears, and no one ever learns what happened to him, which may be the more honest ending, since disappearance was the rule out here, not the exception. A few versions have him walking east on foot, arriving in some new town a broken man, never speaking of the buffalo trade again. Historians who study these boom and bust settlements will tell you these holdout stories appear again and again across the plains, almost as if every collapsed economy produces one. Some see this as evidence of a real pattern, a genuine type of man who could not adjust to sudden loss. Others believe the story is less about any one person and more about grief looking for a shape. A community cannot mourn an economy the way it mourns a person. So It invents a person to mourn instead. There is a version of this story told in an Arapaho family from Oklahoma that complicates the whole picture. In their telling, a man who stayed was not chasing the herd's return at all. He stayed because his wife's family remained, and leaving would have meant abandoning people who had already lost enough. This version rarely makes it into county histories, but it survives at kitchen tables, past the way this kind of memory always survives, through people who were there and the children they told. You can feel the pull of that loyalty even now, if you let yourself imagine standing beside him. The wind would have moved through the empty post, like breath through a hollow bone. The hide scales would have swung once, then gone still. You would have understood, standing there, why some men could not simply climb onto a wagon and ride toward whatever came next. No one can say for certain if he was one man or many men blurred together by time. No one can say if the story began as memory or as metaphor, dressed up later to feel like fact. What survives is the feeling underneath it, a sense that leaving a place you built with your own hands takes something out of a person that the ledgers never counted. If you had been there in those final weeks, watching the post empty out around you, you might have understood why someone would choose to stay, even as the world that made the place worth staying in had already ridden off without him. Stand in the middle of a Kansas pasture, and you will find a bell. It hangs from a rusted iron frame, bolted to a concrete slab that once held a schoolhouse. The building is gone. The children who rang that bell are gone. Their children's children are gone too, scattered to Wichita and Denver and Los Angeles, and places their grandparents never heard of. But the bell stays. Somebody, at some point, decided the bell should not fall with everything else. And that decision tells you more about these lost towns than any ledger or survey map ever could. Here is the truth that sits beneath all the arguing over dates and numbers. It does not matter, in the end, whether the herd count was 4 million or 6 million. It does not matter whether the bank failed in a single afternoon or bled out over 3 slow years. What matters is that people built a life here. They named their children after these streets. They buried their infants under these grasses and marked the graves with stones they hauled 40 miles by wagon. Whatever happened to the buffalo, whatever happened to the railroad's promises, it happened to real families who felt every bit of the loss. You can hold on to the debates if you want. The historians will keep arguing about market timing and Eastern demand, and the exact week the price of hides broke in Kansas City. Let them. Somewhere else, a woman named Sarah Whitfield stood in a doorway in 1878 and watched her husband load a wagon with everything they owned, and she did not care about market timing at all. She cared that the town she had built her whole life inside of was closing its eyes forever, one house at a time. That is the part the archives cannot hold. A courthouse record will tell you a business closed on a certain date. It will not tell you the sound of a wife crying behind a closed door, or the particular way morning light fell through a window that would never again have curtains. The paper trail gives you facts. It does not give you grief, and grief is what these towns were actually built from, once the money left. Think about what it takes to build a town from nothing. You need faith that tomorrow will look something like today. You need to believe the railroad really is coming, that the herds really will return each spring, that the bank really does have your money safe inside its vault. Every building raised on these plains was an act of faith in a future that never quite matched the promise. When that future did not arrive, the faith did not just disappear. It turned into something else. It turned into an ache that these places carried, quietly, until the last resident finally gave up and drove away. Look at what people chose to save when they left. Not the heavy furniture, not the tools that took a lifetime to gather. They saved photographs. They saved family Bibles with the births and deaths written in fading ink on the inside cover. They saved bells, sometimes wrenched loose from schoolhouses and churches, and loaded onto wagons bound for towns that might actually survive the next 10 years. A bell weighs almost nothing next to what a family loses when a town dies. But it rings, and ringing was something these people needed to still believe in. Stand at one of these old town sites today, and the quiet will press in around you like a held breath. Wind moves through grass that has grown back over cellar holes and street grids nobody remembers laying out. A rabbit crosses what used to be Main Street, unhurried, as if it never knew there was a street there at all. This ground does not care that men built a bank here, a hotel here, a dry goods store on the corner where two roads used to cross. The grass has already forgotten the argument entirely, but you will not forget, standing there, that someone loved this place enough to plant a garden by a doorway that no longer exists. Someone taught children multiplication tables under a roof the wind eventually carried off, board by board, over 40 patient years. Someone rang that bell every morning at 8 and every afternoon at 3, calling children in from fields that no longer grow anything but native grass and old bones of fence posts leaning at 45-degree angles. None of that required the buffalo economy to have worked exactly the way the textbooks describe it. It required only that people were here and that they believed for a while that here was going to last. The bell still hangs. Nobody rings it now. But if you stood beneath it in the wind, you would swear you could still hear something moving through the iron, low and slow, like a memory looking for its own name. Stand still for a moment. Let your eyes adjust. Out here, past the last fence post, past the last gravel road, the dark comes down heavier than anything you have known in a city. No streetlight fights it, no porch light softens it. The sky over the plains at night is a black bowl turned upside down, and it holds more stars than you knew existed, scattered like salt thrown across a table. You are standing where a hide yard used to be. Maybe you know that, maybe you do not. Either way, your boots are sinking a little into old grass that has grown back over ground that once held wagon ruts 3 feet deep. The wind moves through that grass now, and it makes a sound like breathing, slow and even, the way the whole prairie seems to breathe when nothing human is left to interrupt it. This is the place where a commodity swallowed 100 towns. Not fire, not war, not plague, just an animal, and the trade built around its hide, and the silence that came after the animal stopped showing up. Picture it as it was, just for a moment, laid over the dark, like a transparency held up to a lamp. Fires burning in rows, where wagons camped, men shouting prices at each other over stacked hides that stood taller than a house, lanterns swinging from post to post, throwing long shadows across ground churned to mud by 10,000 hooves and boots. The air back then would have smelled of blood and tallow and wood smoke, thick enough to taste. Now the air smells like nothing but grass and coal dust, and the only motion is the wind finding gaps in fences that have not held cattle in decades. Listen, somewhere out past where the buildings would have been, a coyote calls once, then goes quiet, as if it heard something answer that you did not. The sound carries for what feels like a mile before the plains just absorb it, the way they absorb everything eventually. That is the thing about this land at night. It takes in sound and light and memory, and it gives almost nothing back. You are small out here, and that smallness is not frightening. It is honest. Under a sky this wide, everything human-sized starts to look temporary, including the boom towns that once stood exactly where you are standing. The hunters who built fortunes here in a single season believed the herds would never end. The bankers who financed them believed the same. The sky did not care what they believed. It just kept turning overhead the way it turns now, patient as stone, indifferent as water. If you crouch down and put your hand flat against the ground, you might feel it holding the day's last warmth, the way plain soil always does after sundown, releasing heat slow and steady like a body cooling. Beneath your palm, somewhere down in that dark earth, there could be a fire pit nobody ever found, a broken awl, a scatter of bone nobody bothered to dig for. The ground remembers in its own quiet language, one that does not translate easily into artifacts or records. It just holds what it holds and says nothing. Above you, the stars wheel slow across the black, the same stars that watched wagon trains crawl toward this ground, with hope stitched into every mile. They watched the wagons leave again just as quietly, going the other direction, faster this time, lighter, with less to carry because there was less worth carrying. The stars did not mark the difference. They never do. They simply kept their positions, indifferent witnesses to a fortune that rose out of grass and returned to grass within the span of one restless decade. A little wind picks up cool against your face, carrying the faint mineral smell of dust that has traveled farther than you have tonight. Somewhere, a dry stalk of last year's grass ticks against another, a small dry sound, like a clock with no hands. It is the only clock this place has ever needed. It measured the buffaloes coming and going long before any hunter arrived with a rifle, and it kept measuring long after every hunter left. Stand here a little longer if you can stand the quiet. Let it settle over your shoulders like a coat. This was once a place loud enough to keep men awake at night with the sound of money changing hands. Now the loudest thing for miles is your own breathing, and even that seems to disappear into the dark, swallowed the same way everything else was swallowed here, gently, completely, without any explanation offered at all. Stand on the plains today, out where the old trading posts used to be, and the wind will still find you. It moves through the buffalo grass the same way it moved through it 150 years ago, low and steady, whispering over ground that once held a city of hide tents and cook fires. Nothing marks the spot. No sign tells you a fortune passed through here and vanished, but people who live in this country carry something the maps do not. They carry the memory of what disappeared, even when they cannot say exactly what it was. Ask a rancher in western Kansas about the old hunting camps, and you might get a shrug at first. Then, if you wait, you get a story. Maybe it is about a grandfather who plowed up bones by the 100, wagon loads of them, more bones than a man could count in a lifetime. Maybe it is about a place on the land where the grass grows different, greener in a ring, as if something rich once fed the soil there and never left. The stories do not always agree, but they all point at the same hollow space in history, the same feeling that something large stood here and then did not. This is what the collapse of the buffalo economy actually left behind. Not ruins, not a graveyard of buildings you can walk through and photograph. It left a habit of wandering. Families who have farmed the same quarter section for 4 generations will tell you Their land holds secrets, and they say it plainly, the way you might mention the weather. They plough up trade beads. They plough up rusted trap parts and the corroded shells of tins that once held gunpowder. They find these things and hold them up to the light, and for a moment the empty grass in front of them fills with a town that only their hands can prove ever existed. Some communities turned that memory into something people could gather around. Small county fairs across Kansas, Nebraska, and the Texas Panhandle still hold Buffalo Days, with cookouts and games built loosely around the old hide hunting era. You will not find grand museums standing on the actual post sites, because there is nothing to build a museum on. What you find instead are folk festivals held in the nearest surviving town, celebrating an economy that vanished before anyone thought to write its history down. The irony sits heavy in the air at these gatherings. People eat buffalo burgers and dance to fiddle music in celebration of a boom that ruined their great-great-grandparents. Historians who study the plains argue about what this cultural memory actually preserves. Some say the festivals and family stories keep something true alive, a rough oral record passed hand to hand because no other record survived. Others say the stories have drifted so far from fact that they now describe a myth, not a history, a version of the hide trade shaped more by longing than by memory. Both sides agree on one thing. Whatever the trading posts were, they left almost nothing solid behind, and that absence is what people have been filling in ever since. For the tribes who watched the herds die and the traders vanish, the legacy runs differently. Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Comanche families do not tell festival stories. They tell survival stories, passed down with a gravity the settler folklore does not carry. Elders speak of grandparents who watched their whole way of living collapse in less than a decade, faster than anyone could adjust to, faster than any of the traders' own downfall. That memory does not get a county fair. It gets held closer, spoken more carefully, treated less like folklore and more like inheritance. You feel the weight of both of these legacies if you drive this country slow enough to notice it. A gravel road might take you past a historical marker no taller than a fence post, easy to miss, naming a trading post that operated for 18 months before it stopped existing. A few miles further, you might pass a small community building where a tribal council still meets, still carries forward stories the settlers never recorded and never could have understood. Two memories running parallel across the same grass, neither one able to fully explain what actually happened here. What survived is not a monument. It is a habit of telling, a low hum of stories passed down because the ground gave the people so little else to hold on to. Stand out here at dusk, when the light turns the grass the color of old paper, and you can feel where the memory persists even without proof. The wind took the buildings. It took the graves, the shortcuts, the wagon ruts. It left only the telling, and the telling refuses to stop. If you pull out an old survey map of the plains today, you will find names that lead nowhere. Towns marked with a small circle and a proud label, sitting on roads that dead-end in wheat fields. The paper says a place is there. The ground says otherwise. That gap between the map and the dirt is where this story keeps living, long after the wagons and the hide wagons stopped rolling. A woman named Clara Voss carried one of these gaps all the way to California. Her grandfather had traded hides outside a post that the maps called Bishop's Crossing, though nobody agrees anymore on where that name came from. She grew up hearing about it the way other children heard fairy tales. except this one came with a tin cup her grandfather kept on the mantel, dented on one side, worn smooth on the other. He said the cup was the only thing that made it out of the post before the herds vanished and the buyers stopped writing letters. He never went back. He said there was nothing to go back to. Clara moved west in the 1930s, chasing work like so many did, and she took the cup with her in a wooden trunk. She told the story to her children on porches in the San Joaquin Valley, under palm trees that had nothing in common with the plains her grandfather described. The wind was different there, softer, carrying orange blossoms instead of dust. But the story did not change to fit the new place. It stayed exactly the size it had always been, a town that filled up fast and emptied faster, a fortune that walked away on 4 legs and never came back. That is how these stories travel. They do not fade the way buildings fade. They ride in trunks and in memory, moving with the people who leave, landing in kitchens 1,000 miles from where the dirt still holds the truth nobody wrote down. You can picture Clara at her own stove, decades later, stirring something on the fire, telling her grandchildren about a cup and a crossing that no map could find anymore. The story had outlived the ground it came from. Her grandson, a man named Everett, eventually made the trip east to look for Bishop's Crossing himself, sometime in the 1970s. He had the old survey coordinates and a photograph of the tin cup, and he had a feeling that felt more like faith than fact. He drove for 2 days and found wheat where a city was supposed to have stood. He found a fence line that a farmer told him had been there since before the farmer's own father was born, which meant it predated any memory of a trading post at all. He stood in that field for an hour, he told his family later, just turning in a circle, trying to see what his grandfather had seen. He found nothing that could prove the place existed the way the family always said it did. No foundation stones, no rusted stovepipe, no church bell buried in the grass. If you had stood beside him in that field, you would have felt the wind pull at your collar and the sun sit heavy on your neck, and you would have understood why he almost gave up hope right there. But a farmer's wife, hanging wash nearby, told him something her own grandmother used to say, that the ground out past the tree line used to sing on quiet nights, a low sound like wind through empty bottles, though no bottles had ever turned up when anyone looked. She said her family always figured it was just wind through the grass. She said they never quite believed that themselves. Everett drove home without proof, but not without something. He carried the story back the way his great-grandfather had carried the cup, undamaged by the absence of evidence. Some folklorists who study these plains towns say this is the real inheritance, the thing that outlasts the boom and the bust both. Not a foundation, not a name on a deed. A count passed hand to hand, softened at the edges like river stone, still recognizable 100 years and 1,000 miles from where it started. Skeptics point out that memory bends with distance, that every retelling probably added a little and lost a little until the Bishop's Crossing in Clara's kitchen might barely resemble whatever stood on that ground in the 1870s. That may be true. Nobody can measure it against a record that does not exist. But the tin cup still sits in a drawer in California today, dented and smooth, and somewhere in Kansas or Nebraska, a fence line still holds a shape that nobody built on purpose. If you laid your hand flat against that fence post, you would feel a heat that has nothing to do with the sun, just old wood, remembering the use it no longer serves. You could stand today on a stretch of Kansas grass that once held 2,000 people and see nothing but a fence line and a hawk turning slow circles overhead. That is what pulls people back, not the mystery of what happened. Everyone knows what happened. The hides stopped coming, the money stopped moving, and the town let go like a hand opening. What pulls people back is the question underneath that one. How does a place hold 2,000 lives and then hold none, and leave so little proof that either version was ever true? Every few years, someone tries to answer it properly. A graduate student with a truck full of survey stakes, a retired teacher with her grandfather's journal and a metal detector, a county historical society that pools its money for one summer of digging, hoping the ground will finally say something back. They walk the grass in grids, the way you'd comb a beach for a lost ring, and mostly the grass says nothing. A rusted hinge, a shard of blue glass, a button with no coat left to hold it. The land keeps its secrets the way it keeps everything else out here, without effort and without apology. You would feel that same reluctance if you walked it yourself. The ground gives you a beer bottle from 1974 before it gives you anything from 1874. History gets crowded out here, and the newest layer always sits closest to the surface. You start to understand why so many searchers leave with more questions than they came with, their boots heavier with mud than with answers. Some researchers believe the last true trading posts are still out there, unmarked, waiting for the right flood or the right drought to peel back enough dirt to show a foundation. The plains have done it before. A dry summer in the 1930s uncovered wagon ruts nobody knew were there. A flash flood in the 1990s washed out a hillside near the Cimarron and left bones in the mud, some human, most bison, tangled together the way they must have died. Nobody has proven those bones belonged to a hunting camp, but nobody has proven they didn't. Other researchers think the search itself is built on a wrong idea. They argue these places were never meant to last, and so they left nothing to find because there was nothing permanent to leave. A camp built to be broken down by spring is not a ruin waiting for discovery. It is simply gone, the way a fire is gone once the wood burns through. Looking for its remains in this view is like looking for the shape of yesterday's wind. You can feel where it blew. You cannot dig it up. Both ideas can be true at once, and that is part of what keeps people coming back. Somewhere between a hidden foundation and a vanished fire sits the actual truth, and nobody has walked far enough into that middle ground to claim it. The plains do not argue, they just wait, patient as they have always been, letting each generation bring its own shovels and its own theories, and taking almost all of it back into the grass by the next spring. If you drove those back roads now, you would pass places where the land dips slightly, where the grass grows a little too even, where a shape under the soil might be a cellar or might be nothing but old drainage. Locals will point you toward these dips, the way they'd point toward a grave they weren't sure was really there. They speak of it carefully, almost gently, the way you'd talk about someone who might still be listening. You get the sense they want you to look, and also want the ground left in peace. Both feelings live in the same breath out here, and neither one wins. The people who return year after year, decade after decade, are not chasing proof anymore. They are chasing the feeling of standing somewhere that once held a city's worth of noise, now silent enough to hear your own boots in the grass. That silence is the real artifact. It survived every flood, every plough, every century of forgetting, when nothing else did. You would stand there and feel the pull yourself, the way a house feels different once you know someone used to live in it, even if every trace of them is gone. The grass would not tell you their names. It would not tell you where the trading post walls once stood, or which direction the wagons rolled out for the last time. It would only hold still around your boots, waiting the way it has waited for 150 years, for someone to ask the question loud enough that the ground finally answers back. You have walked a long way tonight, across the plains, through the boom and the bust, past the trading posts that grew into cities and vanished like breath on a cold window. If you are still here, still listening, you have felt the weight of all that empty grass. You know now why the maps get quiet in certain counties. You know why the wind sounds different out there, if you believe the old folks who say it still carries voices. The buffalo economy built fast, and it fell faster. That is the plain truth sitting underneath every ghost story in this episode. A hide was worth real money one season and worthless paper the next. A town could rise in a year and disappear in less time than that. There was no cushion under any of it, no second industry waiting to catch the people when the first one dropped them. The grass grew money for a while. Then the money stopped growing and the grass just grew back over everything, quiet as it always does. We talked about the trading posts, but worked like small cities, full of language and trade, and lives lived at the edge of the herds. We talked about the speed of the animals, how 1 million buffalo could be somewhere in October and gone by December, and how the people who depended on them had to move just as fast or lose everything. We talked about banks that believed their own stories, preachers who stayed past the point of reason, and a house left with the table set, as if the family meant to come right back and never did. Every one of those stories points at the same hole in the record. Something enormous happened out there, and the ground barely remembers it happened at all. Historians will tell you the paper trail thins out, because these places were never truly mapped, never fully counted, gone before the surveyors could catch up to them. Others will tell you the thinness is the story itself, that a place can hold 1,000 lives and still leave nothing behind when the thing holding it together walks away. Both ideas are probably true at once. The plains do not keep records the way cities do. They keep silence instead, and silence is a harder thing to read. What nobody argues about is the speed of the fall. 1 year, there is a rail line promised, a bank open, a schoolhouse bell ringing kids in from the yard. A few years later, there is a bell hanging in an empty frame, swinging in wind that has nobody left to notice it. The commodity that built the town was the same commodity that erased it, and the arithmetic of that